The most dangerous person in any story is the one everyone underestimates. Let that sink in. History has been shaped not by the obvious, flashy, or loud, but by the overlooked, the quiet operators, the ones nobody saw coming until it was too late to stop them. In war, intelligence, business, even relationships, the real game changers are often hiding in plain sight, mistaken for just another face, until the moment they flip the entire script. And that's exactly what's happening here. Right now, somewhere in the tangled web of their plans, they're sitting with their head in their hands, replaying every interaction with you up, and realizing with an almost comedic horror, wait, they were the one the whole time. It's hitting them like a bag of bricks with your name on it, and it's not even wrapped in gift paper. Here's a little fact for you. In psychological studies on perception, researchers have found that humans are wired to misjudge consistent humility as lack of ability, which means, while you were staying grounded, they were filing you under harmless. But instead of harmless, you were gathering skills, connections, and insight until you became the only piece that could make the whole puzzle fit. So now the game's flipped. The background character in their script just became the main event. The name they almost forgot is now the one they can't get out of their mouth. And the part that stings the most, you didn't just arrive at this moment, you've been here all along, watching, learning, and quietly positioning yourself while they slept on you like it was a full-time job. Buckle up, because in the next few moments, we're going to break down why it's hitting them so hard that you were the one the whole time, and why they'll never recover from the way this truth has rearranged their entire reality. Number 1. They mistook your struggle for irrelevance. For the longest time, they watched you go through hard seasons and decided you weren't worth paying attention to. In their mind, someone who was really the one wouldn't have to fight so hard just to stay afloat. They looked at your challenges and took them as proof that you were weak, unlucky, or just not cut out for anything significant. What they didn't understand was that your struggles weren't signs of failure. They were the very process that was shaping you into someone unstoppable. While they were writing you off, you were learning skills they'd never need to learn, because their comfort zones kept them sheltered. You learned patience when doors stayed shut. You learned strategy when resources were scarce. You learned how to think on your feet when nothing went as planned. And all of that became an invisible advantage they couldn't see because they were too busy judging the surface of your life. The irony is, they confused a delayed spotlight with a lack of potential. They assumed success was about constant winning and smooth roads, when in reality, the people who truly last are the ones who can endure storms without losing focus. Your ability to keep moving when everything was against you didn't make you irrelevant. It made you dangerous in the best way. They couldn't grasp that your so-called setbacks were actually training you to survive and thrive in environments that would crush most people. You were becoming the kind of person who could walk into chaos and still know exactly what to do. And because your victories didn't happen in public, they underestimated just how much you had grown behind the scenes. Now the tables have turned. The very resilience you built in those difficult seasons is the reason you're standing strong, while some of the people who once seemed untouchable are now struggling. They had comfort, you had grit, and grit always lasts longer. The truth hitting them now is simple, but brutal. What they dismissed as irrelevance was actually preparation. The fight they thought was breaking you was building you. And now that you've stepped into the position they never thought you'd reach, they have to face the reality that they misjudged you completely. And there's no rewinding that. Number 2, their distraction was your training ground. They were so caught up in competing with each other that you barely made it onto their radar. Their eyes were locked on their own rivalries, their own insecurities, their own need to outshine someone else in the room. In their rush to prove themselves, they completely overlooked you, and that became the single biggest mistake they could make. While their attention was scattered, yours was razor sharp. You weren't distracted by ego battles or petty one-ups. You were busy quietly sharpening your skills, learning the game, and stacking advantages without noise. This gave you something rare, time and space to grow without interference. They weren't studying you, so they never learned how you moved or thought. They didn't take the time to understand your methods or your mindset because they were convinced you weren't a factor worth calculating for. That blind spot was your training ground. Every step you took, every piece of knowledge you gathered, every connection you built, all of it happened under the cover of their inattention. When people are in competition, they leave openings. They become predictable, sloppy, and short-sighted because they're more focused on outdoing each other than protecting the bigger picture. That's where you slipped in. You had the freedom to master things they didn't even notice needed mastering. You learned the ins and outs of the system while they were busy trying to look impressive within it. You found the loopholes, the patterns, the subtle moves that actually matter in the long run. The best part is because they never considered you a threat, they didn't build any defenses against you. They had walls for the people they feared, strategies for the people they envied, but when it came to you, they left the door wide open. So when your moment came, you didn't have to break through resistance. You simply walked in and took your place. Now the reality is sinking in for them. The person they ignored turned out to be the one they should have been watching all along. And the sting is sharper because they can't rewrite history. They can't undo the years they wasted fighting the wrong battles while you built yourself into the one person who could step in and take the lead without even breaking a sweat. Number 3. You outlasted the ones who outshined you. The people they once placed on pedestals, the ones who seemed untouchable and destined to win, have already faded into the background. They burned bright for a while, but it didn't last. Their momentum came from applause, from constant validation, from the need to stay in the spotlight. And when that attention shifted, so did their strength. Meanwhile, you were still moving, still building, still showing up, even when nobody was watching. You didn't need the crowd to keep going, and that's why you outlasted them. It's not that you were racing them, you were simply built for endurance. They ran their paths like sprinters, fast, flashy, but unable to sustain the pace. You, on the other hand, learned how to move steadily through setbacks, delays, and seasons where nothing seemed to be happening. You developed a kind of internal fuel that didn't run out just because conditions weren't ideal. That kind of resilience is rare, and it's exactly what separates the ones who make noise for a moment from the ones who leave a mark for years. They used their opportunities as performance stages. You used yours as building blocks. Every challenge you faced added another layer to your strength. Every small step forward was an investment in something bigger. While they were chasing recognition, you were preparing for longevity. That's why when the initial wave of excitement around them faded, they had nothing to stand on. You, however, had a foundation so solid that time and pressure couldn't shake it. What's heading them now is not just the fact that you're still standing. It's that you're stronger than ever. You didn't just survive. You kept advancing while they stalled out. They remember how convinced they were that you'd never catch up, and now they have to watch you surpass them without having played by their rules. It's a reality they can't spin, deny, or control, because the proof is in the fact that you're here, and they're not. Outlasting them wasn't about beating them at their own game. It was about playing a completely different one. One that doesn't rely on instant wins, but on unshakable consistency. And now they're left with the uncomfortable truth. The person they thought would fade away is the only one still in the running, and there's no catching up to you now. Number 4. You weren't competing. You were being positioned. They assumed you were playing the same game they were, measuring your moves against theirs, secretly hoping to outdo them. In their minds, every step you took was part of some invisible scoreboard where they were keeping track of who was ahead. But the truth is, you were never even in that competition. Your path wasn't about trying to win over them. It was about being in alignment with something much bigger than their limited view of success. Their trophies, their applause, their temporary victories. None of it had anything to do with the mission you were on. While they were locked into chasing quick wins, you were focused on building something that couldn't be measured in likes, promotions, or public praise. You weren't distracted by the noise of comparison because you knew your role wasn't to compete, but to prepare. Every move you made had weight and intention. Even if it looked small to them, That's why their highs and lows never affected you. Their scoreboard wasn't even part of your field. They failed to realize that positioning looks different from competing. Competing means trying to outdo the other person in the same arena. Positioning means knowing where you're supposed to be and aligning yourself with the timing, resources, and connections that will get you there. Sometimes that means moving slower. Sometimes it means letting others win rounds you were never meant to fight in. To them, it looked like you were losing. To you, it was strategic patience. Now they're beginning to see the difference. Their victories, while loud, had short lifespans. The doors they fought for so aggressively led to rooms that eventually emptied out. Meanwhile, you've stepped into a place that they can't touch, not because you pushed past them, but because you were never trying to go where they were going in the first place. What stings them most is the realization that all their energy spent trying to beat you was wasted, because you were walking a path they couldn't even qualify for. Your alignment with your purpose put you in a position that competition can't win, and ambition alone can't buy. And now that you've arrived, they can't help but see that you were never behind. You were being positioned the whole time. Number 5. They couldn't read you, so they misread you. They couldn't figure you out, and that made them uncomfortable. People like them are used to reading others quickly, labeling them, and then deciding how to deal with them. But you didn't give them enough to work with. You didn't move in predictable patterns. You weren't out here posting every win, explaining every decision, or rushing to prove your worth. And because you weren't visibly hustling for approval the way they were, they decided you must not know what you were doing. In their minds, visibility equals value. If you weren't loudly chasing after every opportunity or fighting to be noticed, you must have been unprepared, disconnected, or unimportant. What they didn't realize was that you were running on an entirely different operating system. You didn't need constant attention to validate your progress because your focus wasn't on the crowd. It was on the plan. You understood that the loudest person in the room is often the least strategic, and you had no interest in being noise when you could be precision. The truth is, while they were busy feeding their need to be seen, you were playing moves they didn't even have the vocabulary to describe. You weren't reacting to trends. You were setting up for outcomes they didn't even know were possible. Every step you took was calculated to fit into a bigger picture, one that didn't require their approval or even their understanding. Their misread of you worked in your favor. By underestimating you, they left you room to operate without interference. They didn't prepare for you, they didn't defend against you, and they didn't see you coming. So when the results of your strategy started to show, it caught them completely off guard. Now they're realizing that the signs were there the whole time. The quiet confidence, the consistency, the refusal to get swept up in every passing wave. But because you didn't follow their formula for success, they mistook your silence for ignorance. That mistake cost them more than they'll ever admit. Because by the time they realized you weren't clueless, you were already too far ahead for them to catch up. Number 6. Your consistency was the silent evidence. They didn't see the value in the small, steady steps you were taking, because they were too focused on grand gestures and dramatic wins. To them, success was about those moments that made people clap, those public displays that shouted, "Look at me." They thought the only way to prove yourself was to have explosive breakthroughs that everyone could witness. But while they were chasing applause, you were showing up, quietly, consistently, without fanfare, and building something they couldn't compete with, a flawless track record. Consistency isn't glamorous, and that's why they overlooked it. It doesn't make headlines. It doesn't demand instant attention. It's the kind of work that feels invisible until the results become undeniable. You didn't skip steps. You didn't disappear when things got inconvenient. You did the work even when no one was watching, and that created a foundation so solid that nothing they threw together in a rush could compare. While they were trying to prove themselves in bursts, you were proving yourself in patterns. You weren't there just for the moments that counted in public. You were there for all the ones that counted in reality. And over time, those consistent actions told a louder, more credible story than any single flashy achievement ever could. People might have missed it at first, but patterns are hard to ignore once they're in full view. Now when they look back, the evidence is staring them in the face. They can trace your journey and see that you didn't just appear out of nowhere. You've been doing this solidly for a long time. That history speaks for itself. It shows that you weren't lucky, you weren't handed anything, and you weren't just in the right place at the right time. You were the one putting in the work day after day, building something that could stand. And here's the part they can't escape. Consistency wins in the long run because it outlasts hype. Their big moments might have sparked short-lived excitement, but your steady record created undeniable credibility. In hindsight, it's obvious you were the one all along, not because you made the most noise, but because you never stopped showing up. Number 7. You were the bridge. They didn't think they'd need. They spent so much time acting like you didn't matter that it never crossed their minds they might one day need you. You weren't part of their inner circle, you weren't their go-to, and you definitely weren't the one they bragged about knowing. To them, you were just there. Someone easy to overlook because you didn't fit into their definition of importance. But while they were overlooking you, you were building skills, knowledge, and relationships that they didn't even realize they were missing. Then the cracks started to show in their carefully constructed world. Plans began falling apart, connections broke down, and the people they thought they could count on disappeared when things got hard. That's when it hit them. The very person they had dismissed was the only one who could piece everything back together. You had the experience, the perspective, and the adaptability to navigate the mess they were drowning in, because you had quietly been preparing for situations like this long before they happened. The truth is, you didn't just show up in the moment of crisis, you had been positioned there for a reason. While they were relying on charm, shortcuts, and quick fixes, you were learning how things actually work. You understood the systems, the processes, and the deeper connections that keep everything running. You became the bridge between chaos and order, not because you were trying to prove yourself, but because you were equipped to do what they couldn't. What stings them most is that they can't rewrite history. They can't erase the fact that they ignored you when you could have been an asset from the beginning. They can't undo the moments they underestimated you or treated you like you had nothing to offer. And now, they have to swallow the reality that without you, their plans stall, their connections crumble, and their power doesn't hold up. Being the bridge isn't about being the hero they finally notice. It's about being the one who could stand where no one else could. And deep down, they know that's what makes you irreplaceable. The fact that when everything was falling apart, you were the one holding it all together. Number 8, you broke rules. They didn't even know were chains. They moved through life following rules they never stopped to question. Rules that weren't written down but were enforced through pressure, fear, and this is how it's always been. These weren't just guidelines. They were invisible chains that kept everyone operating within the same small box. They called it tradition, professionalism, or the way the game is played, but in reality it was control disguised as order. And while everyone else bowed to it, you had the audacity to ask, why? That question alone separated you from the rest. You didn't blindly follow the script. You noticed how much of what they called the system was really just a set of habits and power plays designed to keep certain people in control. And instead of accepting it, you started moving differently, not recklessly, but intentionally. You broke away from methods that didn't make sense, even if they were how it's always been done. You ignored hierarchies that existed only to stroke egos. You sidestepped traditions that were nothing more than recycled limitations. By doing this, you uncovered doors they didn't even know were there. You found unconventional routes, unseen opportunities, and creative solutions that were invisible to people stuck in the old way of thinking. While they were all competing for a seat at the same table, you realized there were other rooms entirely. And you built a way to get to them. That's why you're in a position they can't access. They've never even thought to question the barriers that kept them out. What unsettles them now is that you didn't just bend the rules. you expose the fact that those rules weren't unbreakable in the first place. And once that truth is out, it changes everything. They can't go back to believing the limits are real, and they can't deny that you were the one who proved it. This is why you're capable of leading the shift they can't. They're still tangled in the politics, the traditions, and the power games that kept them safe but stagnant. You're free from it, which means you can move faster, think wider, and make decisions without being bound by false laws. They were loyal to the chains. You broke them, and now you're leading the way. Number 9. They measured you by their standards, not your assignment. They judged your progress using their scoreboard, assuming their measures of success were the only ones that mattered. To them, winning meant having visible status, stacking money, and being surrounded by people who validated you. And because you weren't chasing those things at their speed or in their way, they decided you were behind. In their minds, you were moving too slowly, missing opportunities, or simply not ambitious enough. What they didn't understand was that your life was never meant to follow their blueprint. You weren't here to compete for the same prizes they value. Your timeline wasn't designed to impress a crowd. It was designed to fulfill a calling, one that operates on a completely different clock. While they were sprinting for quick wins, you were moving in step with something that can't be rushed and can't be measured in shallow milestones. Their mistake was thinking that delayed visibility equals lack of progress. They didn't see that while they were chasing applause, you were building something that could stand the test of time. Their metrics were temporary, yours were eternal. They cared about looking successful in the moment. You cared about becoming unshakable for the future. And because they only measured what could be seen, they missed the depth of what was happening behind the scenes. The irony is, their ahead isn't ahead at all if it leads to a dead end. Many of the things they fought so hard to acquire are already losing their shine. Some of the doors they broke themselves to enter led to empty rooms. Meanwhile, you're stepping into positions and opportunities that can't be taken from you because they weren't built on trends, hype, or public approval. Now they're realizing the uncomfortable truth. They've been comparing you to their race, not realizing you were running in a completely different direction, towards something lasting. They were fixated on now. You were anchored in forever. And because your assignment is tied to something bigger than their standards, no amount of judgment from them can alter it. They thought you were behind, but in reality, you were right on schedule, just not on theirs. And now that the results are starting to show, their measuring stick suddenly looks very small. Number 10. They saw your lack, but missed your leverage. They were quick to point out everything you didn't have: the money, the backing, the network, the influence. In their eyes, your lack of visible resources automatically meant you were at a disadvantage. They believed that without certain tools and connections, you could never get far. Because for them, those things were the only way to move forward. What they didn't understand was that scarcity, in your hands, wasn't a limitation. It was a training ground. When you don't have excess, you learn how to make every move count. You learn to spot opportunities others overlook because they're too comfortable to notice them. You learn how to stretch a single resource into something that multiplies. You learn to think creatively, to be resourceful, and to adapt when things don't go as planned. And while they were relying on abundance to make up for their lack of skill, you were sharpening abilities that can't be bought. Your scarcity forced you to develop resilience. You knew how to keep going without the safety nets they depended on. You learned to operate under pressure, to stay calm in uncertainty, and to get results without a perfect setup. That's the kind of strength that can't be replicated by someone who's always had everything handed to them. So while they were building with more tools but less grit, you were learning how to outmaneuver them with half the resources. You became quicker to adapt, sharper in your decisions, and better at executing with precision. They underestimated you because they couldn't imagine someone with less being able to surpass them. But less for you never meant weak. It meant efficient. Now they're seeing the outcome of what they missed. You've been able to move into spaces they thought you'd never reach, not because you had more, but because you knew how to do more with less. And the part that unsettles them most is that even if they suddenly stripped you of everything you have now, you'd still know how to rebuild. Your leverage isn't in what you own, it's in what you've learned, and that's something they can't take, buy, or outmatch. Number 11. You grew roots while they grew branches. They were obsessed with being seen, so they poured all their energy into stretching outward. They wanted more eyes on them, more attention, more reach, anything that made them appear bigger and more important. To them, growth meant visibility. The wider they could spread their image, the more successful they believed they were. But they never stopped to secure the foundation that would keep all that growth alive. You, on the other hand, took a different approach. While they were busy chasing reach, you were building depth. You didn't rush to be everywhere at once. You focused on becoming unshakable where you were. You invested in the unseen parts of your life: character, discipline, skill, understanding. You made sure your values, your work ethic, and your purpose were rooted deep enough to withstand pressure. It wasn't flashy. It didn't bring instant applause, but it made you unmovable. When storms came, and they always do, the difference was undeniable. Their branches, as impressive as they looked, couldn't hold up. The very reach they bragged about became their weakness because they had no real strength to support it. Opportunities dried up. Public opinion shifted. Their names stopped circulating, and without a deep root system to sustain them, they broke. You, however, stood firm. The winds that knocked them down didn't move you because you weren't built on exposure. You were built on stability. You had the depth to weather the seasons when nothing looked certain. And when the storm passed, you were still there, ready to grow again, stronger than before. Now, it's clear to anyone watching that your growth wasn't accidental. You weren't lucky to survive. You were prepared to survive. The very patience they mocked is what kept you in the game. The depth they ignored is what gave you staying power. And the most humbling part for them, while their reach had shrunk to nothing, your roots are still expanding, making it only a matter of time before you start producing more than they ever could. They wanted to be seen. You chose to be strong, and strength always lasts longer than show. Number 12. They couldn't replace you because they never understood you. They tried to figure you out, but they never really got it. They assumed your results came from some formula they could study, copy, and then use to outdo you. They thought if they watched you closely enough, they'd find the exact moves you made and replicate them for themselves. But what they couldn't grasp was that you weren't following a script in the first place. Everything you did came from a place they couldn't touch, a combination of who you are, what you've lived through, and the way you see the world. That's not something you can download, duplicate, or fake. When they tried to imitate you, it fell flat. They could match the surface-level actions, the style, the words, the timing, but they couldn't produce the same results because they didn't have the same foundation. Your authenticity gave weight to everything you touched. It made your presence hit different. It made your work resonate in ways that can't be manufactured. People can sense when something is real, and that's the advantage you've always had. They underestimated just how much of your success came from intangible things: your instincts, your lived experiences, your intuition, and your ability to connect on a deeper level. These aren't skills you can just pick up by watching someone. They're built over time, through challenges, risks, and choices that shape you into exactly who you're meant to be. Without that authenticity, all they had were empty performances. The harder they tried to replace you, the more obvious it became that you were irreplaceable. Every attempt to fill your space highlighted what was missing: the energy, the insight, the subtle touches you brought that no one else could replicate. They could mimic your style, but they couldn't recreate your substance. Now they're left with the reality they didn't want to face. Your value was never in the moves themselves, but in the person making them. And because they never understood you, they never understood why you were the one who could make it work. That's why you're still here, holding a position they can't take. Not because you fought to keep it, but because it was never theirs to claim in the first place. Number 13. You were the constant in their chaos. They didn't see it while it was happening, but you were the one quietly keeping things from falling apart. Even when they dismissed you, talked over you, or acted like you weren't essential, your presence was holding everything in place. You weren't loud about it, you weren't demanding credit, and you weren't trying to make anyone notice. You were simply doing what needed to be done. And because you did it so consistently, they mistook it for something that would always be there, no matter what. The problem with being the stabilizing force is that people start to take it for granted. They think the balance just happens on its own, that the peace and order in their environment is natural. They never stop to consider that someone is actually maintaining it. So they make the mistake of assuming you're replaceable, or worse, irrelevant. But the truth revealed itself the moment you stepped back. Without you there to quietly hold the moving parts together, the cracks began to show. Miscommunication increased, tensions rose. Small problems they never noticed before started becoming big ones. Things that once ran smoothly began to stall, and the control they thought they had over the situation started slipping. That's when it hit them. You weren't just a part of the environment, you were the axis it spun on. You were the steady point that kept the chaos from spiraling, and because you never made a big show of it, they didn't realize how much they relied on you until you weren't there. Now, looking back, they can see the pattern. The stability they enjoyed wasn't random. It was the result of you quietly showing up, keeping things aligned, and holding people and processes together. Without you, there's no real order, no real flow, and no one to anchor things when they start tipping out of balance. The irony is that they thought removing you wouldn't make a difference, when in reality it was the one move that made the difference they couldn't afford. You weren't a background presence, you were the foundation, and once the foundation is gone, it's only a matter of time before the whole structure starts to shake. Number 14, you were the answer, hidden in plain sight. They spent so much time and energy looking everywhere else for the answer that they never stopped to realize it was right in front of them the whole time. They traveled far, paid experts, chased new connections, and tried every flashy fix they could find, all while you were standing there, carrying exactly what they needed. You weren't hidden because you were out of sight. You were hidden because they refused to look at you as someone capable of being the solution. Their blind spot was fueled by their own assumptions. Maybe they thought you were too ordinary, too close, or too familiar to hold the answer. People often overlook the ones they see every day because they confuse proximity with insignificance. In their minds, someone out there had to be the savior, someone with a bigger title, louder presence, or shinier image. And so they dismissed the quiet, steady, undeniable resource that was you. But life has a way of bringing the truth to the surface. When all the external options failed them, when the expensive advice didn't work, the so-called experts ran out of ideas, and the shiny connections turned out to be hollow, they were forced to face the fact they had overlooked you. The same person they didn't value, didn't listen to, or even doubted, had the exact insight, skill, and presence to solve what they couldn't fix. The sting is sharper because you weren't hiding. You didn't keep your gifts locked away. You were simply being yourself, offering what you had when it was needed, and showing a level of capability they never thought to connect with the solutions they were chasing. Now that the truth is hitting them, it's not just the realization that you were the answer. It's the regret that they wasted so much time ignoring what was already available. And now, there's no